Cut off dad after he ruined my childhood, but he's the perfect dad to his stepdaughters. So, growing up, I always felt like something was off with my dad. I mean, I knew he worked hard, but it was more than that. He wasn't just busy, he was distant. He was like never really there for me and my sister Claire. I remember my mom trying so hard to make everything feel normal, but it was obvious something was broken between them. They argued a lot, but it was mostly over small stuff: money, work, random things we did wrong. My dad, James, had this way of making everything feel like our fault. I know it sounds weird, but I still have good memories of him. Like, I got my love for cheesy action movies from him. He'd always watch those, and sometimes we'd sit together and laugh about how unrealistic they were. But even then, it felt like those moments were rare. Most of the time, he'd come home from work, tired and angry, and just kind of take that out on us. Not physically, but with his words, his tone, you know what I mean? He'd make everything seem like it was a burden, and us, his own kids, were part of that burden. The thing is, he wasn't always like that. There were times when he could be nice, or at least less cold. But then, as I got older, I started to realize that nice was only when he had no reason to be mad. The moment something went wrong, even the smallest thing, it was like he became this different person. He'd yell about things that didn't even make sense, like the time I accidentally left a light on in the kitchen overnight. You'd think I burned the house down with how mad he got. He called me careless, said I didn't respect the home, but I was a kid. I didn't know any better. And Claire, she got it worse. She was always the one who stood up to him, and I think that's why he targeted her more. Whenever she tried to defend herself, it just made things worse. She had this strong personality, didn't take crap from anyone, but that only made my dad more frustrated. One time, she asked him why he didn't spend more time with us, and instead of answering, he just exploded, said he was out working to support us, and how dare we question him. It made me scared to even talk to him sometimes. Then one day, everything just kind of fell apart. My mom couldn't take it anymore. They'd been fighting a lot, and it finally got to a point where she had enough. She asked for a divorce. I wasn't surprised, but it still hit hard. I thought, maybe, after the divorce, things would get better. Maybe he'd try harder to be a real dad. I mean, I was old enough by then to understand that adults have their own problems, and I figured, without the constant arguing with my mom, he'd be more present for us. I was so wrong. About a year after the divorce, James remarried. He didn't even tell us. No heads up, no, hey, I'm seeing someone. Nothing. One day I found out he married this woman, Susan, completely out of the blue. I heard it from someone else, not even from him. It was like I didn't exist anymore. But what hurt even more was finding out that her daughters, Lily and Sarah, were invited to the wedding. So basically, he could invite these two girls, who he barely knew, but not his actual daughters. Claire and I were pissed. I mean, how do you get married and not invite your kids? It felt like such a slap in the face. That's when I decided to go no contact. I was done. Claire agreed, and we both just cut him off. I didn't see the point in trying anymore. He clearly didn't care about us, so why should I keep putting in the effort? I remember thinking, if he wants to play dad to someone else's kids, fine, but I'm not sticking around to watch it. For a long time, I didn't talk to him. Honestly, it was kind of freeing. I didn't have to deal with the constant disappointment. I could focus on my life without feeling like I was always trying to chase after someone who didn't care. I met Mike, my boyfriend at the time, and we started building a life together. Things were going good for me, better than they'd been in years. But deep down, there was always this nagging feeling. Like, I still wanted my dad to be a part of my life, even after everything he'd done. When Mike proposed, I thought maybe it was time to let go of the grudge. You know, try to be the bigger person. I figured inviting him to the wedding was a good way to start fresh. I didn't want to carry that anger with me into this new chapter of my life. So, before sending out invites, I unblocked him on Facebook just to see what he'd been up to. I don't even know why I did it, honestly. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I just wanted to know if he'd changed. What I found hit me like a punch to the gut. His profile picture was him, Susan, Lily, and Sarah, all smiling like the perfect little family. The caption said something about how they meant the world to him. The world. He had never, not once, posted anything like that about me or Claire. I just sat there staring at the screen, feeling like I'd been replaced. Like I was never good enough for him to care about in the way he clearly cared about them. It didn't stop there. As I kept scrolling, I saw more and more pictures. Vacations, birthdays, even holidays. He had taken them to Hawaii, something he never did for us. Growing up, the only vacations James took were for himself. He'd go on hunting trips alone and leave us behind. And now he's taking Susan's daughters on fancy trips to tropical islands? I couldn't believe it. The thing that really got me, though, was when I found out he had bought them dogs. He never let us have pets growing up. In fact, he got rid of my dog when I was in school one day because it barked too much. I came home, and my dog was gone. Just like that. He didn't even give me a chance to say goodbye. But here he is, buying these girls dogs and treating them like they're his own daughters. It was like he had a whole new life, and there was no room for me or Claire in it. Seeing all that just opened up old wounds. I realized that no matter what I did, I was never going to have the dad I needed. He was always going to choose someone else over me. It hurt, but at the same time, it made me see things clearly. James was never going to change. He was always going to be the guy who put himself first, even if it meant abandoning his own kids. And honestly, I don't know why I expected anything different. I thought seeing those Facebook pictures was the worst part, but nope. Things got way worse after that. After all the scrolling and feeling like crap, I told myself to just let it go. I was done being angry. I mean, Mike and I had a wedding to plan, and I wasn't going to let James and his new perfect family mess that up for me. But then, something happened that I didn't expect. One day, out of the blue, I get a text from Claire. We weren't talking about James much, but she sends me this screenshot. It's a photo of James and Susan's daughters, Lily and Sarah, wearing matching dresses that looked expensive as hell. And the caption said something like, "Proud dad moment with my beautiful girls." My first thought was, what the hell? Because he never called me or Claire his beautiful girls growing up. Like, not once. I didn't even know how to respond, but Claire wasn't done. She told me she'd been talking to him again, just trying to test the waters and see if things could ever be normal. I didn't blame her. She'd always been more forgiving than me. But then she says James offered to help pay for Lily and Sarah's college tuition. Yeah, you heard that right. College. For them. Let me just pause here for a second. The same guy who constantly told me and Claire that we couldn't afford any extra help when we were applying to colleges. The same guy who made me take out student loans because that's how the real world works. Yeah, he was offering to pay for two girls who weren't even his biological kids. I was fuming. I didn't know if I was more mad or just plain hurt, but either way, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I remember calling Mike and just unloading everything on him. I told him about the tuition thing, about the stupid matching dresses, and how James never once offered to help with our college. Mike was supportive as always, and he just listened while I ranted. But what he said next really stuck with me. You have every right to be upset, Emily, but at the end of the day, is he really worth all this energy? That hit me hard. Like, Mike was right. Why was I letting this man, who clearly didn't care about me or Claire, take up so much space in my head? It wasn't like he was going to magically change and start acting like the dad we deserved. But even though I knew that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It's like all these years of being ignored were bubbling to the surface, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Then the next thing happened. My mom called. Now, my mom and I have always been close, but ever since the divorce, she hasn't talked about James much. She figured we were better off without him, and honestly, she was right. But she calls me one day, and I could tell something was up by the tone of her voice. She says, "You're not going to believe what I heard." Apparently, James had been telling everyone, like family, friends, whoever would listen, that he was so proud of his new daughters, and he couldn't wait to walk them down the aisle when they got married. He was literally going around acting like Lily and Sarah were his real kids. He even told one of our cousins that Susan and her girls were the best thing to ever happen to him. I swear my blood was boiling. Like, how do you go from being a crappy dad who never cared to now being dad of the year for two random girls? It felt like such a slap in the face. And the whole walking them down the aisle thing? That really stung. I mean, I'm the one getting married soon, and he hadn't even reached out to see if I wanted him there. It was clear he didn't care about us anymore, but this felt like a whole new level of rejection. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for him to do the right thing. I decided that if he couldn't be bothered to be a part of my life, then I didn't need him at my wedding. I called Claire to let her know what was going on, and she understood completely. She was dealing with her own issues with James, and while she was trying to keep things civil, she wasn't about to defend him either. Then, just as I was starting to come to terms with everything, I got hit with another shocker. Claire mentioned that James had given Lily one of our grandmother's necklaces. It was this beautiful piece of jewelry that had been in our family for generations. Growing up, Claire and I would always admire it when we visited our grandma, and she would tell us stories about how it was passed down to the eldest daughter. We always assumed it would go to one of us, but nope. Turns out James gave it to Lily, just like that, without even mentioning it to us. I was speechless. I couldn't even process what was happening anymore. How could he just give away something so meaningful? something that was supposed to be part of our family's history, to someone who wasn't even related to us. It was like every little piece of my childhood was being erased, and James was just handing it off to his new family without a second thought. That was the final straw for me. I didn't need any more reasons to cut him off, but this just sealed the deal. I wasn't going to sit back and watch while James replaced us in every way possible. I blocked him on Facebook again, deleted his number from my phone, and decided to focus on the people who actually cared about me, like my mom, Claire, and Mike. I didn't need James anymore. He could have his new family, his vacations, his stepdaughters, and his college funds. I was done chasing after a man who clearly didn't care. I was done letting him hurt me over and over again. Update 1. After blocking my dad on Facebook and deciding I was done with him, I felt this weird mix of relief and anger. Like, yeah, I wasn't going to deal with his crap anymore, but there was still this part of me that couldn't let it go. I kept thinking, how did it get to this point? How did my dad become a stranger who couldn't care less about me or Claire? But as much as I wanted to just move on, life wasn't letting me do that. One day, Claire calls me up, sounding kind of off. She goes, "Hey, did you know Dad is throwing a huge birthday party for Lily and Sarah?" I didn't even need to ask because of course I didn't know. Why would I? I wasn't part of his life anymore. But hearing that still hit me like a punch to the gut. Claire kept talking, filling in all the details. Apparently, James had rented out some fancy venue, hired a DJ, and was throwing what sounded like the birthday party of the year for two girls who weren't even his. The kicker? It was happening right around the same time as my birthday. I'm not even kidding. My birthday was coming up, and he hadn't said anything to me. Not a card, not a text, nothing. But here he was, going all out for Lily and Sarah, like they were the most important people in the world to him. Now, I'm not the type of person who expects big celebrations or anything. I never have been. But the fact that he couldn't even acknowledge my birthday while planning this extravagant party for his stepdaughters? That stung. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard. I mean, this wasn't just him forgetting or being busy. This was him actively putting someone else first. Again. I remember sitting with Mike that night, telling him everything. He just listened, like he always did, but I could tell he was frustrated for me. He asked, "So, what are you going to do about it?" That question threw me off because honestly, I hadn't even thought about doing anything. I'd already blocked James, so what more was there to do? But Mike's question stuck with me. It made me realize that maybe I wasn't done after all. A few days later, I found myself talking to my mom about the whole situation. She wasn't exactly surprised when I told her about the birthday party. She knew how James was, how he'd always been. But then she said something that kind of changed everything for me. She goes, "Emily, you don't have to keep letting him hurt you. You're allowed to stand up for yourself." I hadn't really thought about it like that before. In my mind, cutting him off was me standing up for myself. But maybe there was more I needed to do. Maybe I needed to let him know how badly he'd hurt me. So I made a decision. I was going to write him a letter. Not an angry, rant-filled letter, but something that laid it all out there. I wanted him to understand what he'd done, even if he didn't care. It took me a few days to figure out what to say. I kept starting and stopping, not sure how to even begin. But eventually, I just let myself write whatever came to mind. I told him how disappointed I was in him, how it felt like he'd abandoned me and Claire for this new family. I reminded him of all the times he hadn't been there for us growing up, and how that had only gotten worse after the divorce. I wrote about how hurt I was when I found out he didn't invite us to his wedding, how seeing those Facebook posts made me feel like I didn't even exist to him anymore. I even brought up the college tuition thing, and the necklace he gave Lily, just to drive home the point that he'd completely replaced us in every way possible. The hardest part to write, though, was the end. Because deep down, I knew that this letter wasn't going to change anything. I wasn't expecting some magical apology or for him to suddenly realize how much he'd hurt me. But I needed him to know that I wasn't going to sit back and pretend like everything was okay anymore. I needed him to know that I was done. After I finished the letter, I showed it to Claire. She was supportive, but I could tell she was a little nervous about me sending it. She'd been trying to keep things civil with James, and she didn't want to ruin whatever fragile relationship they had. But she understood why I had to do it. So I mailed it off, not really knowing what would happen next. Weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything. I wasn't surprised, but part of me kept checking my phone, wondering if he'd respond. Nothing. It was like the letter never existed. But then, one day, I get a message. Not from James, though. It was from Susan, his wife. And it wasn't anything nice either. She basically told me that I had no right to speak to James the way I did, that he was doing the best he could, and I was being ungrateful and selfish for not appreciating all he'd done for me and Claire. She went on this whole rant about how raising stepdaughters is just as important as raising biological kids, and that I needed to grow up and accept that my dad had moved on. I was floored. First of all, I hadn't even mentioned her or her daughters in the letter. It was between me and my dad, and somehow she made it all about her. Second, how dare she tell me I'm being ungrateful? She didn't live through the years of neglect and disappointment that Claire and I did. She didn't know what it was like to be constantly pushed aside. I didn't respond to her message. I didn't see the point. But that was the moment I realized something big. James wasn't just choosing his stepdaughters over us. He was letting Susan dictate everything. She had become the most important person in his life, and there was no room for me or Claire. And maybe there never would be. That realization hit me hard. It wasn't just about the vacations or the college money or the birthday party. It was about the fact that my dad had built a whole new life without us. He had made his choice, and as painful as it was, I knew I had to let him go. Update 2. All right, so after that whole mess with Susan's message, I thought things were finally starting to settle down. I had mentally checked out from everything with my dad and his new family. I wasn't expecting anything from him anymore. Like, I was finally in a place where I could focus on myself and my own life, especially with my wedding coming up. But of course, just when I think things are calming down, something else has to happen. A few months before the wedding, I get a call from Claire. Now, we talk a lot, but I could tell right away from her voice that this wasn't a normal chat. She was kind of dancing around the point at first, asking me about wedding stuff, if I'd picked out my dress yet, the usual. Then finally, she just drops it. So, Dad called me. I swear my heart just sank. I hadn't heard from him in so long, I almost forgot he existed. But there it was, hanging in the air like a giant cloud. I asked Claire what he wanted, and she hesitated for a second before telling me, he asked if you'd reconsider inviting him to the wedding. At first, I didn't even know what to say. I mean, after everything, after the years of neglect, after replacing us with his stepdaughters, after giving away family heirlooms and throwing birthday parties like he was the world's best dad, now he wanted to be part of my wedding? I just sat there in silence for a few seconds, processing it. Claire kept going, telling me that he sounded sincere, like he really wanted to be there. She said he mentioned how much it would mean to him to see me get married, how he felt bad for not being a part of my life recently. And then, of course, he had to throw in that whole family is family line, like that somehow erases all the crap he put me and Claire through over the years. It was like a part of me wanted to believe him, you know? I wanted to believe that he finally realized how much he'd hurt us and that this was his way of trying to make amends. But at the same time, there was this overwhelming feeling of too little, too late. Where was all this regret when I needed him growing up? Where was this when he was giving away my grandma's necklace or throwing lavish parties for people who weren't even his kids? I told Claire I needed to think about it. I didn't want to make a decision in the heat of the moment, especially since my wedding was supposed to be a happy day. I didn't want his sudden appearance to mess that up. But of course, once the thought was in my head, it was all I could think about. I talked it over with Mike that night. He was supportive, as usual, but he was also realistic about it. He said, "Do you really want him there? Or are you feeling guilty for not inviting him?" And that question just hit me hard. I did feel guilty, but not for the reasons you might think. I felt guilty because part of me still wanted him there. Even after everything, even after the years of hurt, there was this stupid part of me that still wanted my dad at my wedding. It felt like I was betraying myself by even considering it. The next few days were a blur of back and forth in my head. One minute, I was convinced that I should let him come, give him one last chance to be part of my life. The next minute, I was furious all over again, thinking about how easily he'd replaced me and Claire with his new family. How could I let someone who had caused me so much pain walk me down the aisle? I ended up calling my mom. She's always been the one to keep things grounded, and I knew she'd have some insight. When I told her about James wanting to come to the wedding, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that kind of broke me. "Emily, it's your wedding. You don't owe him anything." That's when it hit me. I really didn't owe him anything. I'd spent my whole life trying to make him care, trying to be the daughter he wanted, but it was never enough. And now, after all this time, I was still thinking about his feelings, when it should have been about me and Mike. I didn't need to invite him just because he was my dad. I didn't need to let him into my life if he didn't deserve to be there. So I made my decision. I wasn't going to invite him. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking he could swoop back in at the last minute and pretend like he hadn't abandoned me. This was my day, and I wasn't going to let him ruin it. When I called Claire to tell her, she was a little surprised, but ultimately understood. I could tell she still had some hope for him, but she respected my choice. And that's all I needed. I didn't need validation from anyone else. I wasn't looking for approval. This was about me finally taking control of my own life, without James hanging over my head. A couple of days later, I sent out the final invitations, and sure enough, James wasn't on the list. I thought I'd feel guilty about it, but honestly, I didn't. I felt lighter, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing after my dad's approval. I wasn't trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. I was just living my life on my terms, and that felt pretty damn good. Update 3. The day of the wedding came faster than I thought it would. I mean, we'd spent months planning, stressing over every little detail, but when the actual day arrived, it felt like it snuck up on me. I woke up that morning, surrounded by my best friends and my sister Claire, who'd been helping me with everything. Honestly, I felt more nervous than I expected, but it wasn't because of the usual stuff. It wasn't about the dress, or the ceremony, or whether the flowers were going to look right. It was about the fact that my dad wasn't going to be there. As I was getting ready, I kept having these moments where I'd wonder if I made the right choice. I knew deep down I had. But you know how it is. There's always that little voice in the back of your mind making you second guess everything. It's like, for so long I'd imagined what this day would be like, and in some tiny corner of my brain, I'd always pictured my dad walking me down the aisle. I guess I had to let go of that version of things, and that's what felt weird. But Claire was there, as always, making sure I didn't fall apart. She knew me well enough to tell when I was overthinking, and every time I started spiraling, she'd snap me back to reality with something like, "Emily, this is your day. You've got nothing to worry about." She was right. I knew she was right. But still, the absence of James hung over everything. As I was getting my hair done, I remember looking in the mirror and thinking about all the times growing up when I wanted him to be proud of me. Like I'd imagine him watching me graduate, or congratulating me on my first job. But none of that ever happened. And now, on one of the biggest days of my life, he wasn't going to be there. But it wasn't because of me. It was because of him. That realization made me feel a lot better. Mike, of course, was the calmest person in the world that morning. He texted me a few hours before the ceremony, just a simple "I love you" that instantly made me smile. He wasn't the type to get wrapped up in drama, and he'd always been the steady, reliable part of my life. The one who showed up, who cared, who loved me for who I was. If anyone was supposed to be by my side on my wedding day, it was him. And when I thought about it that way, it made everything feel right again. The ceremony was beautiful. I don't want to get too cheesy here, but it really was. The sun was shining, the venue looked amazing, and when it came time to walk down the aisle, I didn't feel sad or angry anymore. My mom walked me down the aisle, and honestly, it felt perfect. It felt like this was how it was always supposed to be. My mom's been my rock through everything, and having her there, supporting me as I started this new chapter with Mike, just felt right. And Mike, I can't even explain how I felt when I saw him standing there, waiting for me. All the nerves disappeared the moment we locked eyes. I knew in that moment that this was all that mattered. My dad wasn't there, but that didn't matter. The people who did care, who'd always cared, were there, and that's what counted. The whole day went by in a blur. I remember little moments. Claire fixing my dress, my mom tearing up during the vows, Mike squeezing my hand when I was nervous. But most of it just felt like a whirlwind of happiness. I wasn't focused on James, or what could have been, or any of the past drama. For once, I was fully present in the moment, and it was amazing. Later that night during the reception, Claire pulled me aside. She was smiling, but there was this look in her eyes that told me she had something on her mind. "So," she said, "Dad called me." Just hearing that was enough to make my stomach flip a little, but I was curious. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and now, on my wedding day, he decides to reach out. Claire told me that James had called her that morning, asking how I was and if I was nervous. He didn't ask to come or try to force his way into the day, but he did ask if I was happy. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me was still angry, of course. How could I not be after everything? But another part of me appreciated that he didn't try to make the day about him. It felt odd, but also kind of peaceful. Claire said he sounded different, like he regretted things but didn't know how to fix them. She told him I was doing great and that the wedding was beautiful, and apparently he just said, "That's good. Tell her I'm proud of her." Now I know that's not the grand gesture or apology I had been wanting for so long, but hearing that he was proud of me, even if it was through Claire, hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. It didn't make up for everything, and it didn't change the fact that he wasn't in my life, but it was something. I guess I had to take it for what it was. I didn't call him back. I didn't feel the need to. This day wasn't about him, and I wasn't going to let his random burst of guilt or whatever it was overshadow everything. But weirdly enough, hearing that he was proud of me gave me a little closure. It didn't fix anything, but it felt like the last piece of a puzzle I'd been working on my whole life. By the end of the night, as Mike and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. My dad had made his choices, and I'd made mine. I didn't need his approval or his involvement to be happy. I had everything I needed right in front of me, my husband, my family, and the people who loved me. And that was more than enough. Update 4. After the wedding, life sort of settled into a new rhythm. It was like this huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was finally married to Mike, and everything felt right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about my dad every day. I wasn't replaying the past or wondering if I'd made the right decision about cutting him out of my life. I was just living, and honestly, it felt great. A few weeks after the wedding, Claire and I were hanging out. We hadn't really talked much about the wedding since that day, mostly because there wasn't much more to say. But while we were sitting around catching up on work stuff and life, she brought up Dad again. It wasn't anything big, just a passing comment about how she hadn't heard from him in a while either. I could tell she was still struggling with the whole situation. She wasn't ready to cut him off completely like I had, but she also wasn't trying too hard to keep him in her life. She was in this weird limbo, and I felt for her. "Do you think he'll ever really reach out?" Claire asked, looking kind of lost in thought. It was the first time in a while I'd really seen her get emotional about it. I thought about it for a second before answering. Honestly, I don't know. I used to think he would, but now, I'm not so sure. I wasn't trying to sound harsh, but it was the truth. After everything that had happened, I wasn't holding my breath for some grand gesture from James. It wasn't that I didn't care anymore. It's just that I had accepted that he wasn't going to be the father I'd always wanted. Claire sighed and nodded, like she understood but wasn't ready to admit it herself. We didn't dwell on it, though. We spent the rest of the afternoon laughing and talking about our mom's latest attempt at cooking, which was always a disaster. By the time Claire left, I was back in that good headspace, the one where I wasn't thinking about my dad. But, as life always seems to go, the peace didn't last long. A couple of months after that conversation with Claire, I got an unexpected phone call. It was from my aunt, my dad's sister. We hadn't really been in touch much since the whole thing with my dad started, but I guess she'd heard about the wedding and everything that had happened. Her voice was calm, but there was this undertone that made me nervous right away. "I've been meaning to talk to you about James," she said, and my stomach dropped. I didn't even want to hear whatever she was about to say, but at the same time, I knew I had to listen. She went on to explain that my dad had been going through some stuff. Apparently, he'd been dealing with health problems, and it wasn't looking great. She didn't get into specifics, but the way she talked about it made it clear that this wasn't just some minor issue. I didn't know what to feel. I mean, on one hand, he's still my dad. No matter how much he's hurt me, no matter how many times he's let me down, hearing that he was sick hit me harder than I thought it would. But on the other hand, there was this anger inside me that hadn't gone away. It's like, now that he's sick, am I supposed to just forget everything? Am I supposed to run back to him and pretend like nothing ever happened? I wasn't sure I could do that. I thanked my aunt for letting me know and told her I needed time to think. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, just staring at my phone, feeling torn. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see how bad things really were, but the other part of me, the part that had spent years being hurt by him, was telling me to stay away. I called Claire, of course. I needed to talk it through with her. She was quiet for a while after I told her the news, and then she said something that really stuck with me. "You don't have to decide anything right now, Em. It's okay to take your time." That was the thing, though. How much time could I really take? What if I waited too long and then it was too late? What if I never got the chance to say the things I needed to say? But then again, did I even want to say anything at all? It felt like I was stuck in this emotional tug-of-war, and I didn't know which side to pick. Over the next few days, I went back and forth in my head. I tried to focus on work, on Mike, on the future we were building together, but my mind kept drifting back to my dad. I found myself wondering if this was some kind of cosmic chance to fix things, to say goodbye properly. Or maybe it was just life throwing another curve my way, testing me to see if I'd fall back into old patterns. Finally, after what felt like forever, I made a decision. I wasn't going to reach out, at least not right away. If my dad wanted to talk, if he really wanted to mend things, he could reach out to me. I wasn't going to be the one chasing him down again. I'd spent too much of my life doing that already, and I wasn't going to put myself through it anymore. And so I waited. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and still nothing. No phone call, no message, no sign that he even wanted to fix things. I guess that was my answer. In the end, I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes you have to give it to yourself. My dad wasn't going to give me the apology I wanted, and he wasn't going to become the father I needed. And that's okay. I'd made my peace with it, and I didn't need him to validate my feelings or my decisions. Life kept moving forward, like it always does. Mike and I were building our life together, and I was happy, truly happy. My relationship with Claire was stronger than ever, and my mom was still being her chaotic, wonderful self. And that was enough. It had to be. As for my dad, I don't know. Maybe one day I'll hear from him again. Maybe I won't. But either way, I know I'll be okay. I don't need his approval anymore. I don't need his presence to feel complete. I've got everything I need right here, with the people who've always been there for me. And that, for me, was the real closure. Cut out of the will by mom and stepdad. Because I'm not family, but now that I've inherited $3 million, suddenly they want me back. So let's start from the beginning. When I was 14, my life took a sharp turn. My mom decided it was time to settle down again, this time with a man who already had a son from his previous marriage. He was 17, 3 years older than me, and let's just say we didn't exactly hit it off from the start. The ink wasn't even dry on their marriage certificate when tension started to brew. At first, it was the small stuff. You know, the kind of petty arguments you'd expect when you throw strangers into a house and tell them they're family now. He'd leave his dirty dishes in the sink like they'd magically clean themselves, and I'd be the one getting an earful about the mess in the kitchen. Or I'd find my shampoo mysteriously vanishing faster than usual, only to see my new stepbrother sporting what looked suspiciously like my favorite hair product. It wasn't just the stepbrother antics that got to me, it was how my stepdad handled things. He had this way of just assuming I was the root of all problems. If something was out of place, somehow it was my doing. And mom? She wasn't much help either. She was so caught up in trying to make this new family work that she'd overlook the obvious, always smoothing things over, making excuses for why my stepbrother could do no wrong. A year into this new family setup, mom and stepdad had news they were expecting. That's when the dynamic really shifted. Suddenly, it was all about preparing for the new baby. The house needed redecorating, and guess whose room was conveniently chosen for the nursery? Yep, mine. So, I got shuffled to the smaller guest room, which barely had space for my stuff. It felt like a demotion, a clear message about where I stood in this family hierarchy. As my new half-brother grew up, it became apparent that he was the golden child. My stepbrother, already spoiled, seemed to take cues from this and upped his entitled behavior, knowing he could get away with anything. He dropped out of college and came back home bringing a whirlwind of trouble with him, from late-night parties to dodgy friends coming and going at all hours. Complaints? Met with a shrug from stepdad and sorrowful looks from mom, as if to say, what can we do? I started spending more time at friends' houses, anywhere I could feel a bit normal. School became my escape. I joined clubs, stayed late for extra classes, anything to avoid going home before I absolutely had to. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was survival. The atmosphere at home was suffocating, like constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next blow-up. One particular evening stands out in my memory. I had come home later than usual after a school project. The house was quiet, too quiet, which was unusual. I found a note on the fridge saying they'd gone out for dinner. A family dinner I wasn't told about. It was a simple message, but it hit me hard. It was as if they'd forgotten I existed unless I was there to be blamed for something. The breaking point came not long after my 18th birthday. I'd saved up some money from a part-time job, a job I got despite stepdad's complaints about how it would affect my studies, which was just another way of saying he didn't like not having me around to pin things on. I came home one day to find my room turned upside down. Stepbrother had thrown a party while the parents were out, and somehow my room became the casualty. Beer stains on my project papers, a broken lamp, and my privacy completely violated. I confronted them all at breakfast the next day. Stepdad's response? Cold and dismissive, saying I should have been more responsible with my belongings. Mom just sighed and mentioned something about family sticking together and letting things go. But I was done letting things go. During those teenage years, it seemed like everything I did was under a microscope, but not in the caring, let's help you grow kind of way. More like, let's catch you doing something wrong. My stepbrother, who had become pretty much a professional couch potato, was somehow always off the hook. My little half-brother was just a kid, sure, but the amount of coddling he got made it clear who the favorites were. I remember working on a big science project that I was really excited about. I needed quiet and space, both of which were in short supply at home. I tried to set up a little workspace in the corner of the living room, but it was like I had set up in the middle of Times Square. My stepbrother would blast his music, my little brother would be running around screaming, and there was my stepdad, always finding some reason to tell me to move my stuff. "You're taking up too much space," he'd say, or "Your project is making a mess." It was frustrating. I felt like I was trying to build something delicate in the middle of a tornado. One day, I'd had enough. I packed up my project and marched over to a friend's house. Her parents were always welcoming, and they let me spread out my work in their quiet dining room. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I could think straight. That's when it hit me how abnormal my home life had become. My friend noticed my relief at just being able to work in peace. "You're always welcome here," she said one day, seeing the stress melt off me the minute I stepped into her house. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. It also made me realize that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Home should be your safe place, not somewhere you escape from. I started picking up more shifts at my part-time job. If I wasn't at school or at a friend's place, I was working. Not just for the money, but because each hour away from home was a little easier to breathe. My stepdad didn't like it, always ranting about how a job was distracting me from schoolwork. But I knew the real reason he didn't like it. I wasn't around as much for him to find fault with. As I saved up, the plan to move out started forming more solidly in my mind. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. There was no way my mom and stepdad would take it well. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only way I could get some control over my life. Then came the day I finally told them. I'd found a small apartment not too far from college, and it was affordable on my budget. I sat them down, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm moving out," I announced. The room went quiet. Too quiet. You could cut the tension with a knife. My stepdad was the first to react. "You think you're ready to live on your own, at your age?" he scoffed. My mom just sat there, looking between us, her face unreadable. "I am," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I need my own space. I've saved up enough to manage." The argument that followed was brutal. Accusations were thrown about how ungrateful I was, how I was just trying to get away from my responsibilities at home. My stepdad even tried to guilt me about leaving my little brother behind. "He looks up to you, you know," he said, as if that was enough reason for me to stay in a situation that was making me miserable. But I stood my ground. This wasn't just about wanting my own space, it was about needing it for my mental and emotional health. I packed my things over the next few days, each item I put into a box feeling like a tiny piece of the fortress I was building around myself. The day I moved out, my mom came to my room. I was expecting another argument, but instead she helped me pack. We didn't talk much, but when we did, it was superficial. "Do you need more boxes?" Or, "I can give you some of the old kitchen stuff." It was like if we stayed on safe topics, we could avoid the massive elephant in the room. When I finally closed the door to my new apartment after moving everything in, I felt a wave of so many emotions. Relief, sadness, excitement, fear. I was on my own now, truly on my own. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. Those first few nights were the hardest. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I missed even the annoying noises of my family home. Well, sort of. But as days turned into weeks, I started to appreciate the peace. I could come and go as I pleased. Eat when I wanted, sleep without being disturbed. It was like discovering a new part of myself that I had kept muted for so long. Life away from home settled into a routine pretty quickly, and honestly, it was the most peace I'd had in years. My relationship with my mom and stepdad wasn't great, but it was manageable since I wasn't under their roof 24/7. I was doing my own thing, staying busy with work and college and keeping my head down. Then, out of nowhere, my stepdad had a health scare that shook everything up. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough for him to start thinking about the future, specifically his will. I heard about it through my mom, who called one evening sounding a bit more somber than usual. "Your stepdad's been thinking about his will," she said, as casually as one might talk about the weather. "He wants to make sure everything is in order." "Okay," I replied, unsure where this was going. The tone in her voice hinted it wasn't just a courtesy call to keep me in the loop. She hesitated, then continued. "He's decided to include your stepbrother and your half-brother, but not you. He feels it makes more sense since they're his biological kids." There it was. The sting. Not that I was expecting anything, but hearing it laid out so bluntly was a gut punch. It wasn't the money or the potential inheritance that hurt. It was the clear message that I was an outsider in the family I'd spent over 5 years trying to fit into. "I see," I managed, keeping my voice neutral. "Thanks for letting me know." Mom must have sensed my hurt because she quickly added, "It's just legal stuff, you know? Doesn't change how we feel about you." "Right," I said, not really believing her. The conversation awkwardly drifted to other topics before ending, but the damage was done. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar ache of not belonging. The weeks that followed were tough. I mulled over the conversation again and again. Part of me wanted to confront my stepdad, demand an explanation, or at least tell him how much he'd hurt me. But another part of me wondered why I even cared. I hadn't felt like a part of their family for years. Why was this any different? I decided to pull back, limit my visits even more. It was a defense mechanism, I guess, protecting myself from being hurt further by people who had already shown they didn't consider me family when it really counted. Then, the actual wake-up call came. It wasn't a dramatic event. No yelling matches or tearful showdowns. It was quieter than that, more profound. I was at a coffee shop, working on a term paper, when I overheard a group at the next table. They were laughing, sharing stories about their families, the usual ups and downs, normal stuff. And it hit me. I didn't have that. I hadn't had it for a long time, if ever. That realization sparked something in me. I started to question why I was allowing myself to be upset over being excluded from a will when I had already been excluded from the family in every way that mattered. It wasn't about the money. It was about wanting to feel valued and loved by the people who were supposed to be my family. From then on, I made a conscious decision to focus on the relationships in my life that did make me feel valued. Friends who had become like family, professors who mentored me, colleagues who respected me. I invested more in those connections, and gradually the hurt from my stepdad's will and the feeling of exclusion from my family began to fade. It wasn't an overnight change. There were still moments of bitterness, especially during family gatherings when I'd see my stepbrother and half-brother getting all the attention. But I was learning to accept that some things were out of my control, and where I could, I was building my own sense of family and belonging. The real test came when my stepdad's health scare passed, and life returned to normal for them. I was invited over for a family dinner, a celebration of sorts that he was doing better. I went, more out of a sense of obligation than anything else. The dinner was as awkward as I expected. My stepdad talked about his recovery. Everyone cooed over my half-brother's latest school achievements, and my stepbrother bragged about a new job. I sat there, mostly quiet, and it was clear I was the odd one out. But this time, it didn't hurt as much. I had reached a place of peace with my role in this family. I was the outsider, and that was okay because outside that house, I had people who cared about me for me, not for what I could bring to a will or a family name. After dinner, I left early, making some excuse about an early morning. As I drove home, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was okay, really okay, for the first time in years. I had faced the reality of my situation, dealt with the emotional fallout, and come out the other side stronger and more self-assured. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life has a funny way of throwing you surprises when you least expect it. After getting comfortable in my own routine and accepting the limited, if not strained, relationship with my family, I got a call one afternoon that turned everything on its head. The call was from a lawyer, someone I'd never heard of before, who introduced himself in a formal, almost apologetic tone. He asked if I had a few minutes to discuss the estate of my grand aunt, my dad's mother's sister. Honestly, I barely remembered her. She was one of those relatives you hear about in stories from your parents, but don't really know. She had no children of her own, and I remembered her being mentioned as someone who helped raise my dad. "I'm calling to inform you that your grand aunt passed away recently," the lawyer continued, his voice a mixture of professional and sympathetic. "And she left her entire estate to you." To say I was shocked would be an understatement. I felt a mix of emotions: sadness for her passing, confusion about why she chose me, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility about what was coming next. The lawyer explained that my grand aunt had been quite well off, having invested wisely over her lifetime. She left behind a sizable estate, including a trust fund that was now mine, totaling around $3 million. Just like that, my financial situation changed overnight. After the call, I sat there, phone in hand, trying to process the news. Why me? We weren't close. I visited her a few times, sure, but those visits were more about checking in on an elderly relative than bonding. She must have seen something in me, maybe a reflection of her own independence, or perhaps it was her way of reaching back to family one last time. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with the lawyer, signing documents, and learning exactly what I had inherited. It wasn't just money. There were properties, stocks, and a few personal items that had sentimental value. Among them was a letter she had written, explaining her decision. She admired my independence and determination, something she said reminded her of herself at my age. Equipped with this new wealth, I made some immediate changes. I bought a house, something I never thought I'd be able to afford on my own so soon. It was a modest place, but it was mine, and it represented a new chapter in my life. I also invested in a rental property, thinking ahead about long-term financial security. The rest of the money I put into savings and investments, consulting with a financial advisor to make sure I was making smart choices. But with great wealth comes great responsibility, and as I soon found out, great drama. I hadn't told anyone in my family about the inheritance, wanting to avoid any potential fallout. However, secrets have a way of coming out, and this one was no different. It started with my cousin, who somehow got wind of the inheritance through mutual connections in the legal world. Before I knew it, my mom knew, and once she knew, it wasn't long before everyone else did too. Phone calls started coming in, not just from her, but from my stepdad, my stepbrother, and even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone seemed to have a reason why they needed a piece of my inheritance. Times are tough, they'd say, or, you know how bad his health has been, referring to my stepdad. It was as if they all suddenly remembered I existed, but only as a bank. I was bombarded with requests for loans, gifts, and outright demands for money. It felt like I was watching vultures circling, each waiting for their chance to swoop in. The pressure was immense, and for a moment I faltered, wondering if I was being selfish by holding on to the inheritance. But then I remembered the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family. The years of scrimping and saving, working hard for every dime and getting myself through college without their help. This was my chance to secure my future, and I wasn't going to let guilt or manipulation sway me. When my mom asked directly why I hadn't thought to share the news with her, I had enough. I explained calmly but firmly that the distance between us wasn't just physical, but emotional. Her decisions, and by extension those of my stepdad and stepbrother, had shown me where I stood with them. The inheritance was a chance for me to do things on my terms, without relying on anyone else. It's my life, I told her, and I need to live it my way. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but I have to do what's best for me now. The fallout from that conversation was as expected. Accusations of being ungrateful and selfish were thrown my way, but I held my ground. Over time, the calls became less frequent, and the requests for money dried up as they realized I wasn't budging. It was a tough lesson in who my real family was. It wasn't defined by blood or marriage, but by the people who supported me without expecting anything in return. Those were the relationships I valued and continued to nurture. As for the inheritance, it remained a bittersweet reminder of my grand aunt, a woman I wish I had known better. Her final gift was not just the wealth she left me, but the clarity and conviction to stand up for myself, no matter the cost. The inheritance was supposed to be a blessing, a windfall from a distant relative who thought I might do something good with it. But as soon as word got out that I was suddenly a few million richer, it felt more like I'd painted a target on my back rather than received a gift. After I made it clear to my mom and the rest of the family that I wasn't going to hand out cash just because we shared some DNA, things got chilly. Fast. The phone calls and texts that were initially filled with thinly veiled hints for money turned into outright pleas, and then into angry demands when I held firm on my decision to keep my finances private. It wasn't just the immediate family either. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly very interested in reconnecting. I received messages like, "Hey, just heard about Aunt so-and-so, so sorry to hear she passed, but also could you help me with some money? Times are tough." It was like they all had the same script, only the names were changed. One of the toughest calls was from my stepdad. He'd never been warm, but now he was cold and calculating. "You know, we've always considered you part of this family. It's only right you think of your brothers in this difficult time," he said one day, his voice dripping with a guilt-tripped glaze. "My brothers haven't considered me family unless they needed something," I shot back, surprising even myself with the sharpness of my tone. "That's a harsh way to put it," he retorted, but I could tell he was taken aback. I had never spoken to him like that before. I had always been the compliant stepchild, the one who didn't rock the boat too much. The conversation spiraled from there, with him accusing me of being selfish and me reminding him of all the times I'd felt excluded and unimportant in his family. By the end, we were both too angry to see any reason, and the call ended with a mutual understanding that things between us would never be the same. The final straw came when my mom tried to mediate, which really meant taking my stepdad's side and trying to convince me to share my inheritance. "It's what families do," she insisted during one particularly tense visit where she'd shown up unannounced at my new house. Families also support each other, I countered, feeling both exhausted and exasperated. When have you ever supported me like this, emotionally or financially? She was silent, unable to answer. The truth was, our relationship had been superficial at best for years. This money had just brought all the underlying issues to the surface. After she left, the calls and messages slowed, then stopped. It seemed they had finally accepted that I wasn't going to cave. It was a relief, but also a profound disappointment. It hurt to know that my value to them was tied so closely to what I could provide financially. In the wake of the family fallout, I began to invest more time in my relationships with friends and colleagues, people who appreciated me for who I was, not for my bank account. I also started volunteering, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had the resources or time for before. Giving back on my own terms was healing in a way I hadn't expected. It helped me connect with people, build new friendships, and fill the void left by my family's conditional affection. I also saw a therapist who helped me work through the feelings of betrayal and abandonment that had resurfaced with this whole ordeal. It was tough, unpacking years of emotional baggage, but it was necessary. I learned to set boundaries, to recognize the signs of manipulative behavior, and most importantly, to value my own needs and well-being. One day, I decided to write a letter to each family member who had tried to pressure me for money. In each letter, I explained my feelings, why I had made the decisions I did, and how their actions had affected me. It was more for my closure than anything. I didn't expect any responses. To my surprise, my half-brother replied. He was young, only 14, and his letter was clumsy, but sincere. "I'm sorry for asking for money. I miss you," he wrote. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. We started texting, small conversations about school and his hobbies. It wasn't much, but it was something, a possible bridge to rebuilding at least one family connection. Update 1. Hey everyone, just wanted to update you all on what's been going on since I last posted. It's been a few weeks, and honestly, I wish I could say things have gotten better, but they've actually gone from bad to much worse. I appreciate all the support and advice you guys have given me. It's been a lifeline during this crazy time. So, after everything blew up with my family, my mom reached out to me in August wanting to talk. Given everything that's happened, I had a pretty strong hunch that this wasn't going to be a simple catch-up. To keep things somewhat neutral, we decided to meet at a public place. I figured that might keep the drama to a minimum, or at least keep things from getting too crazy. The meetup was awkward from the get-go. My mom kicked things off by talking about how they've been struggling financially. She mentioned my half-brother's private school fees have become a burden since my stepdad got sick and had his work hours cut. Then she shifted to talking about how they've been wanting to renovate the house and how she desperately needs a vacation to get away from the mental toll of everything. Throughout all this, she didn't ask a single question about my life or how I've been coping. It was like I was just there to listen to her list of problems. I was getting more and more uncomfortable as the conversation dragged on, feeling like I was just a spectator to her woes. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and asked her to just get to the point. Without missing a beat, she said she expected me to write her a check for $1 million. Yes, you read that right, $1 million. She claimed that, technically, it should all be her money since it came from her late husband's inheritance. But she was being generous by only asking for a third. Her demands were growing more and more outlandish, and I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I quickly paid the bill and got out of there as fast as I could. Since that day, my mom has been going around calling me a thief, loudly proclaiming to anyone who will listen that the inheritance should have been hers in the first place. Meanwhile, my stepdad sent me a massive wall of text, lecturing me about how I can't just think of myself when I'm part of a bigger family, and that my decisions should be inclusive of everyone else. I reminded him pointedly how he didn't include me in his will because I wasn't family enough. That seemed to shut him up temporarily, but I doubt it's the end of it. Things have spiraled into absolute madness since then. Both my mom and stepdad have been bad-mouthing me all over the place, and I'm honestly a bit scared about what they might do next. It feels like they're trying to turn everyone against me, painting me as the bad guy in a situation they've blown way out of proportion. I'm trying to stay strong and keep a level head. But it's tough when it feels like the people who are supposed to support you are out to make your life harder. I'll keep you all updated if anything changes. But right now, it's just one big mess. Thanks again for all your support and advice. It really helps to know there are people out there who understand and care. Update 2. Hey everyone, dropping in again for a big update. Trust me, it's been a whirlwind these past few weeks, and honestly, I'm just trying to keep my head above water with all the crazy stuff that's been happening. I really appreciate all the support and advice you all have been throwing my way. It's been a huge help in navigating this chaos, so thank you a ton. So, here's the scoop. A few weeks back, out of nowhere, I get this super official looking letter in the mail. It's from some lawyer I've never heard of, claiming that my mom is suing me for a huge chunk of my inheritance. Yeah, you heard that right. My own mom, suing me. My initial reaction? Full-blown panic. I mean, who wouldn't freak out? My mind was racing, thinking about all the legal battles I'd have to face. But then, just when I thought it couldn't get any more soap opera worthy, my stepdad sends me this ominous text. He's all like, "You'll regret not sharing your money because now we're going to take you for everything you're worth." It was like something out of a bad movie, the villainous step-parent twisting the knife. Seriously, the audacity had my jaw on the floor. Rattled, but not beaten, I sent everything over to my attorney, expecting a whole ordeal. But get this. My attorney literally laughed when he read the letter. Not just a chuckle, but a full-on, "Are you kidding me?" kind of laugh. He tossed the letter into the trash and told me not to lose any sleep over it. According to him, my grandaunt's will is locked down tighter than Fort Knox. There's no way my mom can touch anything legally because she isn't even a descendant, and the will spells out the beneficiaries clear as day. But because my attorney is the thorough kind of guy he is, he didn't stop there. He dug a bit deeper into this so-called lawyer who sent the letter. Turns out, the office address listed is some rundown building that looks like it hasn't seen a tenant in years, and the phone number? Disconnected. No longer in service. Looks like my parents got desperate and decided to hire some fly-by-night, probably not even legit lawyer in a last-ditch effort to scare me into coughing up some cash. Realizing they were just trying to bluff me into surrendering part of my inheritance was both a relief and a wake-up call. They actually thought they could strong-arm me with some half-baked legal threat. The nerve, right? Knowing this, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I mean, I was gearing up for a legal showdown. But now? I'm just shaking my head at the lengths they'd go to. So with that drama sort of deflated, I decided I needed a break from all the madness. I've been on edge, losing sleep, and just generally stressed out. I talked it over with my buddies, and we all agreed. It's time for a little getaway. So I'm taking some time off work to go traveling with my friends next week. Nothing fancy, just a road trip to some places we've always talked about visiting but never got around to. I think a change of scenery is exactly what I need to clear my head and recharge. It's weird, though, thinking about how things have unfolded. I used to look up to my mom and stepdad, you know? And now, seeing how they've acted, it's disappointing. But I'm learning that sometimes you have to step back from the people who are supposed to support you when they start pulling you down instead. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to this trip. A bit of adventure, some good laughs, and quality time with friends. Just what the doctor ordered to get away from the family drama. I'll keep you all posted on how it goes, and if anything else pops up on the home front. But for now, I'm focusing on the positive, on moving forward and not letting this whole mess drag me down anymore. Thanks again for all the support and advice. This community has been my rock through this storm, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate every comment, every message of encouragement. You guys are the best. Here's to better days ahead, right? Catch you all after my trip, hopefully with some fun stories and zero drama. Mean stepsis. Made sure I'm not her family, but now wants me to give up my home for her and her kids. So, let me just start this off by saying, this is kind of a long story, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm Lexi, 25, and I've got a stepsister, Brianna, who's 26. We've also got two younger half-siblings. But this is really about me and Brianna. Well, mostly about how she's been a total nightmare since the moment our parents got married. I was 7 when my mom married her dad, and I guess I was supposed to be happy about gaining a new family and all that. But from the very first day, Brianna made it crystal clear she didn't want me around. Like, I honestly don't even know why. She just hated me right off the bat. I tried to be nice, like any 7-year-old would, right? I thought maybe we could be friends, hang out, maybe play together or whatever kids do. But nope, she wasn't having any of it. She would just look at me like I was trash or something. You know that look where someone doesn't even want to acknowledge you exist? Yeah, that was Brianna. It didn't matter what I did, she would always make sure I knew she didn't want me around. At first, I thought maybe it was because I was the new kid in the family or something. Maybe she was mad about our parents getting married. But as time went on, it became clear that it wasn't just that. She just genuinely didn't like me. At school, it was even worse. We went to the same elementary school, and she made sure everyone knew we weren't real sisters. She would say things like, "Oh, she's just my stepsister," or "We're not actually related," whenever someone brought it up. And she didn't stop there. She'd go out of her way to embarrass me in front of other kids. I remember one time during recess, she told the other kids that I wasn't part of her family and that her dad only married my mom because she needed somewhere to live. I was 7. How are you going to be that cruel to a kid who's just trying to figure out how families work? Her dad, my stepdad, saw what was going on and tried to step in a few times. He'd tell her to knock it off, that we're all family now, and she needed to treat me better. For a while, I think it kind of worked. Like, she stopped being as mean in front of him. But the second he wasn't around, she'd go right back to being a complete jerk. It's like she took pleasure in making me feel like I didn't belong. And honestly, as a little kid, I didn't know how to handle that. I was already trying to adjust to this whole new family situation, and having someone actively reject me made it so much harder. I'd go home after school crying some days, telling my mom about how Brianna was treating me, and she'd always say the same thing. She'll come around, just give her time. Spoiler alert, she never came around. Brianna even started trying to get our younger half siblings involved. Like, she'd tell them I wasn't their real sister, and that they shouldn't listen to me or hang out with me. This was when they were little, so they didn't really understand what was going on. But still, the fact that she would even try to pull them into her little hate campaign against me, that's messed up, right? She was always trying to find new ways to get under my skin. Now, I'm not going to say my whole childhood was horrible because of Brianna. I had good times too, especially with my mom and stepdad. They did their best to make me feel included, and they were supportive whenever I talked about how Brianna was treating me. But there was always that cloud hanging over me, knowing that the one person who should have been my closest ally in all this, my stepsister, wanted nothing to do with me. And when she did want something to do with me, it was just to make me miserable. I think the worst part was when she started spreading rumors about me at school. There was this one time in middle school when Brianna told a bunch of kids that I had stolen something from her, which I hadn't. But kids being kids, they believed her. And suddenly, I was the thief at school. It was humiliating, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just being mean, she was actively trying to ruin my life. Eventually, it got to the point where my stepdad had to step in big time. Brianna's attitude was so bad that she stopped coming over to our house for a while. He told her straight up that if she couldn't at least pretend to be civil, then she shouldn't bother coming around at all. I don't know if that was the right move, but honestly, it was kind of a relief. At least I didn't have to deal with her constantly being in my face, making me feel like crap. She eventually moved in with her mom full time when she was around 13 or so. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, like maybe the distance would give her some perspective or something. But nope, it didn't. We still saw each other sometimes. Holidays, birthdays, that sort of thing. And every single time she made it clear that nothing had changed. She was still just as cruel, just as dismissive, and just as determined to make me feel like an outsider in my own family. By the time we were teenagers, I had pretty much given up on trying to have any sort of relationship with her. I mean, what was the point? I'd spent years trying to be nice, trying to reach out, and she had never once made any effort to meet me halfway. So I just stopped caring. If she wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then fine. I wasn't going to waste any more energy on her. I remember the last time we had any kind of interaction that wasn't straight up hostile. We were 16, and she had just had her first kid. Yeah, she got pregnant at 16 and moved back in with us for a while. You'd think maybe motherhood would change her, soften her or something, right? Nah, she was the same Brianna. If anything, she got worse. She wouldn't let me anywhere near her baby. She told me to never touch her kid, never talk to them, never even look at them. Like I was some kind of monster she needed to protect her child from. It was at that point that I knew for sure. There was never going to be any kind of sisterly bond between us. She made sure of that. And honestly, I was done trying. I had my own life to focus on, and if she wanted to be a bitter, hateful person, that was her choice. But I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her anymore. So yeah, that's where it all started. It's been years since we last saw each other, and honestly, I thought I was done with her. But as it turns out, she wasn't done with me. Alright, so where I left off, I hadn't seen or talked to Brianna in years, and I was honestly cool with that. My life was moving along fine without her drama, and I was doing my own thing. But then, a couple of months ago, I get this phone call from my mom. Now, my mom isn't one to call me for no reason, so I immediately knew something was up. I pick up the phone and she's like, "Hey Lexi, there's something we need to talk about." Right away, I'm thinking, great, what now? My mom has this way of sugarcoating stuff, so I already knew whatever she was about to say was probably bad news. So she starts off all casual, telling me about how Brianna has had a really hard time lately. Apparently, she lost her job a few months ago, and then not long after that, she lost her house. Now she's living with my mom and stepdad along with her 4 kids, and things are, in her words, a bit tense. At this point, I'm still just listening, but I'm not exactly feeling sorry for Brianna. I mean, after everything she's done, how can I? But then, my mom drops the bomb. Brianna's been asking if she and the kids can stay with you for a while. I swear I almost dropped my phone. Like what? Stay with me? The same person who couldn't stand me for years now wants to move into my house with 4 kids? I didn't even know how to respond at first. I just kind of sat there in silence for a minute, trying to process it all. My mom took that as her chance to keep talking, telling me about how cramped their house is and how it would be really helpful if I could take Brianna in for a little bit, just until she gets back on her feet. Now here's the thing. I've worked hard to get where I am. I've got my own place, a job I'm proud of, and a life that's finally drama-free. The last thing I want is to throw Brianna and her chaos into the mix. Plus, 4 kids? That's not a little bit of help. That's a whole new life I didn't sign up for. So I just said, Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. Of course, she tried to talk me into it. Lexi, she's your sister. She's family. Don't you think you should help her out? But honestly, family or not, there's a limit to what I'm willing to deal with. And Brianna passed that limit a long time ago. I told my mom, look, I get that she's in a tough spot, but she's never treated me like family. She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it. My mom didn't exactly like hearing that, but I wasn't about to let her guilt me into something I knew I'd regret. And that's when things really took a turn. The very next day, Brianna called me herself. Now, mind you, I hadn't heard her voice in years, so when I saw her name pop up on my phone, my heart started racing a little bit. I wasn't even sure if I should answer it, but I figured it was better to get it over with. So I picked up, and before I could even say hello, she jumped straight into it. Lexi, I need your help, she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. She sounded desperate, which I guess made sense given the situation, but it still caught me off guard. I mean, this is someone who spent her whole life acting like I didn't exist, and now she's asking me for help like we're suddenly best friends? She went on to explain that she and her kids were crammed into a tiny room at my parents' house, and that it wasn't working out. There was no space, her kids were constantly fighting, and she was at her wit's end. I listened, but all I could think about was how she'd treated me like garbage for years, and now she expected me to swoop in and save her. Then she hit me with the wildest part. She didn't just want to stay with me. She wanted me to move out of my house and move back in with our parents so she and her kids could take over my place. I swear I almost laughed out loud when she said it. Like, is she for real? She basically told me that she needed my house more than I did, and I could help the family by making the sacrifice. I was stunned. I couldn't even form words for a second. When I finally did respond, all I could manage was, wait, you want me to move out of my house for you? I was hoping I misunderstood or something, but nope. She doubled down. Yes, she said, like it was the most normal request in the world. You can go live with Mom and Dad for a while. They have plenty of space. It's just until I get back on my feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who had made my life a living hell, was now trying to kick me out of my own home. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool, and said, Brianna, that's not going to happen. I'm not giving up my house. I worked hard for it, and I'm not about to hand it over to you. That's when she lost it. She started yelling, calling me selfish, saying I didn't care about family, that I was leaving her out to dry. She even threw in the fact that I don't have kids, like that somehow made me less deserving of my own home. She was full-on guilt-tripping me, trying to make me feel bad for not helping her out. But here's the thing, I wasn't going to fall for it. Not this time. I'd spent years trying to make peace with her, trying to be the bigger person, and where did it get me? Nowhere. So I just calmly said, Brianna, I'm sorry you're in this situation, but it's not my responsibility to fix it. You've never wanted anything to do with me, and now all of a sudden I'm supposed to uproot my life for you? No. That didn't go over well. She started screaming even louder, telling me I was a horrible person, that I was turning my back on my own family. It was honestly pretty shocking how fast she turned from desperate to angry. I didn't know what else to say, so I just hung up the phone. After that, I didn't hear from her for a while. I figured she had gotten the message, but I was wrong. A few days later, my mom called again, and this time she was really upset. Apparently, Brianna had been complaining to her nonstop about how I was being selfish and unwilling to help. My mom, bless her heart, was still trying to play peacemaker, saying, Can't you just let her stay for a little while? She really needs help, Lexi. But I wasn't budging. I told my mom the same thing I told Brianna. I'm not giving up my house, and I'm not letting her walk all over me. I've had enough of her crap. My mom wasn't happy, but I could tell she was starting to get where I was coming from. Brianna's entitlement was off the charts, and even my mom couldn't deny that. Still, she was stuck in the middle, trying to keep the peace between her 2 daughters. But I wasn't about to let Brianna use that to manipulate me anymore. Update 1. Alright, so after the whole phone call mess with Brianna, I was feeling pretty good about standing my ground. I figured she'd either find another solution or keep complaining to our parents until they got sick of her. Either way, it was out of my hands, and I could finally get back to living my life. Or so I thought. A couple of weeks later, I was sitting at home on a Saturday, just minding my own business, when there's a knock at my door. Now, I don't really get many visitors, so I was a little confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and honestly, I kind of hoped it was just some delivery guy with a package or something. But when I opened the door, guess who was standing there? Yep, Brianna. She was standing on my doorstep with all four of her kids and a bunch of suitcases. My stomach dropped. Like, seriously? I just stood there for a second, not even knowing what to say. She looked at me with this dead serious expression and said, "Lexi, we need to talk." I felt my face get hot. I wasn't mad at first. I was more shocked than anything. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my cool. Her kids were all standing there, looking tired and kind of confused, and I felt bad for them. But I couldn't believe she actually showed up like this. Brianna sighed like she was annoyed with me, which made no sense. "Look, Lexi, I've got nowhere else to go. It's too cramped at Mom and Dad's, and they're getting frustrated with me. I thought you'd have a little more empathy, considering we're family." I could feel my jaw tighten. Empathy. After everything she put me through, she wanted to play the family card now? I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that she was standing on my porch, clearly expecting me to just let her and her kids move in. I wasn't having it. "Brianna," I said, trying my best not to lose my temper. "I already told you I'm not letting you stay here. I don't know why you thought showing up unannounced would change anything." She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "You're being ridiculous. It's not like I'm asking for much. We'll only be here for a little while, just until I can find a new job and a place for the kids." At that point, I could feel the anger bubbling up. "You're not staying here," I said, louder this time. "I'm sorry you're in a tough spot, but you've never wanted anything to do with me. And now you expect me to just drop everything for you?" Her kids were starting to get restless, and I could tell this conversation wasn't going to go anywhere good. Brianna, of course, wasn't giving up that easily. She shifted her weight and said, "It's not just about me, Lexi. Think about the kids. They need somewhere stable. Don't you care about them?" Okay, let me pause for a second here. Of course I care about the kids. They didn't do anything wrong, and it's not their fault their mom put them in this situation. But that doesn't mean it's my responsibility to fix everything. I had no connection to them, thanks to Brianna making sure I was never part of their lives. So, while I felt for them, I wasn't about to let her guilt me into taking them in. "I care," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of their lives. You didn't want me near them. Now all of a sudden I'm supposed to play the hero?" She huffed and glared at me. "It's not about the past anymore, Lexi. You need to grow up. Things are different now. I'm asking you as a mother, not as your stepsister." I couldn't believe the nerve of her, as if her being a mother erased all the crap she put me through growing up. I took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't going to end well. "Brianna, I'm not doing this. You need to leave." Her face twisted into something like a mix of anger and desperation. "So that's it? You're just going to turn your back on me? On the kids? After everything we've been through, you're just going to let us suffer?" At that point, I was done. I was trying to stay calm for the sake of the kids, but her entitlement was too much. "You made your choice a long time ago," I said firmly. "You didn't want me in your life then, and I'm not letting you use me now." She glared at me, her eyes narrowed. "You're unbelievable. You really think you're better than me, don't you?" That hit a nerve. I wasn't trying to act like I was better than her. I just wasn't about to let her walk all over me. But before I could even respond, her oldest kid, who looked like she was around 10 or so, tugged on Brianna's arm and said, "Mom, can we go? I'm tired." Brianna glanced down at her, and for a second I thought maybe she'd give up and leave. But nope, she turned back to me and said, "You're making a huge mistake, Lexi. Don't think I'm going to forget this." And with that, she stormed off, her kids trailing behind her. I watched as they loaded back into their car, Brianna muttering under her breath the whole time. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or just angry. Probably a mix of both. As they drove off, I shut the door and leaned against it, trying to process what just happened. I mean, I knew Brianna was entitled, but showing up at my house with her kids and expecting me to just roll over like that, it blew my mind. I felt bad for her kids. They didn't deserve any of this. But I wasn't about to let Brianna manipulate me into giving up my home. After she left, I called my mom to let her know what happened. She wasn't surprised, but she did sound disappointed that I didn't help. "I understand, Lexi," she said, "but Brianna's in a really tough spot right now. Maybe there's another way you can help." But I had already made up my mind. "Mom, I'm not getting involved. I can't. She's never treated me like family, and I'm not about to let her drag me down into her mess." my mom sighed. I just wish things were different. Me too, I said, and I meant it. But some things never change, and Brianna was one of them. Update 2. After Brianna and her kids left, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Like, she'd finally understand that I wasn't going to give in and she'd move on to bothering someone else. But of course, that's not how it worked out. Honestly, I should have known better. It didn't take long before things escalated in a way I wasn't expecting. A few days after her dramatic visit, I got another call from my mom. Now, this wasn't unusual. She and I talked fairly often, but the second I answered, I could tell something was up. Her voice was tight, like she was stressed or trying not to yell, which immediately put me on edge. Lexi, I need to talk to you about what happened with Brianna, she said, jumping straight into it. I sighed. Mom, I already told you what happened. She showed up at my house and I told her she couldn't stay here. Yeah, well, she's been talking to your stepdad and me nonstop since then, saying how unfair you're being. She's claiming you're turning your back on family and she hesitated. And she's saying we should be cutting you off for not helping her. I was stunned for a second. Like, Brianna was really out here trying to turn my own mom and stepdad against me because I wouldn't let her take over my house? The audacity! I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Wait, she's telling you guys to cut me off? Pretty much, Mom replied. She's making it sound like you're heartless for not helping her and the kids when they need it. She's really got your stepdad all worked up. He's been talking about how we should be doing more to support her as a family. I couldn't believe it. Mom, you know that's ridiculous, right? She's trying to manipulate you because I won't give her what she wants. Mom sighed, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. I know, Lexi. I get it. But things are getting tense here. Your stepdad feels like we should be supporting her more, especially with the kids involved. And Brianna, well, you know how she is. She's making us feel like we're failing her as parents. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was exactly what I was afraid of. Brianna pulling everyone into her drama and making me the villain for not bending to her demands. Mom, listen, I get that she's in a bad spot, but that doesn't mean I'm responsible for fixing her problems. I've been more than clear about why I can't help her. I know, Mom said softly, but you need to understand that your stepdad is struggling with this. He doesn't like seeing his daughter in such a rough place, and he feels like we should be doing more to make sure the kids are okay. And there it was, the guilt trip. It wasn't even Mom doing it on purpose, but hearing her talk about the kids like that made me feel like I was the bad guy. But I wasn't. I knew that. Brianna was using her kids as pawns in her little game, and I wasn't about to let myself get played. Mom, I'm not going to let Brianna guilt me into anything. I understand that the kids are in a tough spot, but that's on her, not me. She's the one who's made her choices, and now she has to deal with the consequences. Mom was quiet for a moment, and I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say next. Finally, she spoke. Lexi, I wish things weren't like this. I hate seeing the family so divided. Me too, I said, my voice softer now. But this isn't on me, Mom. Brianna has been treating me like I don't exist for years, and now all of a sudden she wants my help? That's not how family works. There was another pause, and then she sighed. I know, you're right. But just be prepared, Lexi. Your stepdad is really upset, and I'm worried he's going to take Brianna's side in all of this. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd always had a decent relationship with my stepdad, and the thought of him turning on me because of Brianna's manipulations made me feel sick. But I couldn't back down now. I had to stand my ground no matter how messy things got. Thanks for the heads up, Mom, I said quietly, but I'm not going to change my mind. I know, she replied. Just be careful, okay? I don't want this to get any worse. After we hung up, I couldn't help but feel this knot in my stomach. It was like no matter what I did, Brianna was determined to drag me into her mess. And now she was turning my stepdad against me too? It was exhausting, and honestly, I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. But of course, Brianna wasn't done. A few days later, I started getting calls from other family members, people I hadn't talked to in months. My aunt, my cousin, even some distant relatives on my stepdad's side. Every single one of them had the same story. Brianna had been going around telling them how I'd refused to help her when she was desperate and homeless, painting me as the villain in her little sob story. It was infuriating. I knew she was manipulative, but this was a new low, even for her. I spent half my time fielding calls from concerned relatives, all of them trying to guilt me into doing the right thing by helping her out. I couldn't believe how easily she'd managed to get them on her side, even though none of them knew the full story. At one point, my cousin, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, called me up and started lecturing me about family values and how I was letting my pride get in the way of helping someone in need. I was so close to losing it, but I managed to keep my cool long enough to explain my side of the story. Look, I told her, you don't know the half of it. Brianna's been treating me like dirt since we were kids. Now she wants me to give up my home for her? That's not happening. My cousin tried to argue, saying that people change and that Brianna was just trying to survive, but I wasn't having it. She hasn't changed at all, I said, my voice firm. She's just using this situation to get what she wants. I'm not falling for it. By the time we hung up, I was exhausted. I couldn't believe how much energy Brianna was draining from me, even when she wasn't physically in my life. It was like she'd found a way to invade my space without even being there. As the days went on, the calls finally started to die down, but the tension with my mom and stepdad was still there. Every conversation felt like it was walking on eggshells, and I could tell they were struggling to balance their loyalty to me with their guilt over Brianna. It was a mess, and I hated that it had come to this. But no matter how much pressure they put on me, I wasn't going to give in. Brianna had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. And if that meant I had to be the bad guy in her story, so be it. Update 3. So, after all the chaos of Brianna trying to weasel her way into my life and my house, you'd think things might finally calm down, right? Wrong. Because of course, Brianna had one more trick up her sleeve. This time, though, it wasn't just phone calls or guilt trips from relatives. It was something way worse. It started with a knock on the door. Now, after everything that had happened, I was a little paranoid about people just showing up at my place unannounced, so I wasn't exactly thrilled to hear knocking. I checked the peephole, and there was a man standing there in a uniform. My heart sank because I immediately thought something bad had happened. I opened the door, and he handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I stared at the envelope, confused and a little freaked out. I hadn't done anything wrong, so what was this about? I opened it right there, and to my absolute shock, I was looking at some kind of legal paperwork. It took me a second to process it, but when I finally understood what I was reading, I couldn't believe it. Brianna was suing me. For what? To force me to let her and her kids stay in my house. I'm not kidding. She had actually gone and filed some kind of claim that I was denying her housing or some nonsense, trying to legally force me to give up my home for her and her kids. I could barely even comprehend it. I mean, who does that? She couldn't guilt me into it, so now she was trying to legally take my home? I felt this wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. I didn't even know you could do something like that. I called my mom immediately and told her what happened. She was just as shocked as I was. "That can't be real," she said. "There's no way she can do that." But it was real. I double-checked the paperwork, and sure enough, Brianna had actually gone to a lawyer to try and pull this off. I was in total disbelief. I called a lawyer myself to figure out what my options were, and thankfully, he reassured me that this whole thing was ridiculous, and there was no way it would hold up in court. Still, the fact that Brianna had even tried something like this was insane. The lawyer told me not to worry too much, but we'd still have to deal with it legally, so we started prepping. I couldn't believe it had come to this. I mean, it's one thing to have a toxic family member who tries to take advantage of you, but to actually sue your own stepsister because she won't give you her house? That's a whole new level of entitlement. A few weeks later, we had the court date set, and I was feeling pretty nervous. I knew I had the law on my side, but I also knew how manipulative Brianna could be. I was worried she'd try to spin the situation to make me look like the bad guy again, like she'd been doing with our family. But there was no turning back now. We had to go through with it. When the day finally came, I walked into that courtroom feeling a mix of anxiety and anger. Brianna was already there with her lawyer, and when I saw her, I swear she didn't even look worried. If anything, she looked smug, like she actually thought she was going to win. I sat down with my lawyer, and we started going over everything. The judge called us up, and Brianna's lawyer started making this whole case about how she was a struggling mother of 4, and I had refused to provide housing for her in her time of need. The way they talked, you'd think I was some kind of heartless monster who kicked her and her kids out onto the street. I couldn't believe the lengths she was going to make me look bad. She didn't mention, of course, how she'd been horrible to me for years or how she'd tried to manipulate me into giving up my house. It was all about how she was a single mom, just trying to provide for her kids, and how I was the selfish stepsister standing in her way. When it was our turn, my lawyer laid everything out. He explained how Brianna had never wanted anything to do with me until she needed something, how she had shown up at my house unannounced, demanding that I move out so she could move in, and how she'd been trying to guilt me into helping her, even though we had no real relationship. The judge listened carefully, and I could see him nodding along, understanding where I was coming from. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The judge turned to Brianna and asked her point blank, "Why do you believe you are entitled to your stepsister's home?" And that's when it all fell apart for her. She stuttered and tried to make it about the kids again, but the judge wasn't having it. He cut her off and basically told her that this was a ridiculous claim. He explained that I had no legal obligation to let her stay in my house, and that just because she was in a tough situation didn't mean she could take advantage of family. Hearing the judge say that out loud was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Brianna looked like she'd been slapped in the face. Her smug attitude completely disappeared, and she just stood there, speechless. I could see the realization hit her. She wasn't going to get what she wanted this time. The judge dismissed the case, and that was it. I walked out of that courtroom with a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. Brianna didn't even look at me as we left. She just grabbed her stuff and stormed out with her lawyer. I wasn't sure what would happen after that, but I knew one thing. I was finally done with her. When I got home, I called my mom to tell her what happened. She was relieved, but also sad. I could tell she was still struggling with the whole situation, and I felt bad for her. But at the same time, I couldn't keep letting Brianna ruin my life. Enough was enough. Since then, Brianna hasn't tried to contact me. I haven't heard a word from her, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I've got my life back, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control again. So yeah, that's the story of how my stepsister tried to take my house and ended up losing everything. It's not exactly the happy ending I wanted, but at least now I know where I stand. And honestly, I'm just glad it's over.
The first-class cabin hummed with quiet luxury, but Sophia Carter's heart raced. She hadn't planned for confrontation today, but as the flight attendant brushed past her, delivering headphones to every passenger but her, Sophia felt a sharp pang of indignation. For a moment, she considered letting it slide. After all, she was here to escape the stress of her billion-dollar empire, not to attract attention, but something in the attendant's condescending smile made her pause. This was not a small oversight, it was a subtle yet deliberate reminder of the battles Sophia had fought her entire life. With every microaggression, her sharp instincts told her, this was about more than headphones. It was about the quiet power struggle of prejudice, something Sophia had overcome time and time again. Yet today, in the place she had worked so hard to belong, the sting of discrimination cut deeper. Sophia glanced out the window at the fading light on the tarmac, a storm brewing inside her. This was her airline, a company she had built from the ground up, and now it was her responsibility to decide whether to fight or let it go. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, Sophia made a choice that would not just change the course of this flight but transform an entire industry. At Real Life Stories New, we bring you tales that uncover the power of resilience and the pursuit of justice. What Sophia did next shocked everyone, and the ripple effects of her actions will leave you inspired. Stay with us to find out how this single moment sparked a movement. As the flight attendant disappeared down the aisle, Sophia's fingers tightened around the armrests. Her usual calm was disrupted, replaced by a quiet storm of frustration. She had spent years breaking through barriers, proving that success and power didn't come with a single face. Yet here she was, in a space she had earned tenfold, still fighting for the dignity others took for granted. Sophia took a deep breath, her mind racing. She replayed Karen's words, "Those are only for first-class passengers." They echoed like a challenge, deliberate and sharp. Sophia could sense the judgment woven into the flight attendant's clipped tone. This wasn't just about being overlooked, it was about being diminished. And she wasn't about to let it slide. Her phone buzzed faintly against the tray table. For a fleeting moment, she considered drafting an email, direct but professional, her usual weapon of choice, but she set the phone aside. No, this needed more than words on a screen. Sophia wasn't fighting just for herself, she was standing for anyone who had ever been dismissed, questioned, or undervalued. Her resolve deepened. This wasn't just a moment to endure, it was a moment to act. The tension in the cabin thickened as the flight continued. Karen's forced politeness toward others stood in stark contrast to her icy demeanor around Sophia. When the tray of drinks arrived, Karen's hand accidentally tipped the glass, spilling water onto Sophia's lap. Sophia stared at the damp fabric of her tailored slacks, her mind calculating the deliberate nature of every slight. She dabbed at the stain with controlled movements, refusing to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her falter. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you okay?" The man across the aisle, a middle-aged passenger with kind eyes, leaned toward her. His concern was genuine, his tone quiet but firm. "I saw what she did. That wasn't an accident." Sophia met his gaze, her expression steady. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with steel. "But I have my own way of handling this." The man nodded, leaning back in his seat. His silent support fortified her resolve. Sophia reached for her phone again, this time scrolling purposefully through her contacts. She didn't hesitate as her thumb hovered over a familiar name, James Everett, the CEO of the airline. Her voice was low but unwavering as she recounted the events to him, each detail crisp and pointed. She didn't need to exaggerate, the facts alone spoke volumes. By the time she ended the call, the weight on her chest had lessened slightly. James's anger was palpable, his assurance resolute. "This will be handled, Sophia. I won't let this stand." Karen avoided Sophia's row for the rest of the flight, but her earlier confidence had crumbled. Her polished demeanor now seemed forced, every interaction betraying an undercurrent of unease. The other passengers exchanged glances, their whispers filling the cabin as they speculated about what was unfolding. But Sophia sat still, her composure unbroken. She wasn't angry, she was focused. This was no longer about headphones or spilled water. It was about accountability, about ensuring that Karen's behavior didn't go unchecked. As the plane touched down, Sophia's decision crystallized. She waited patiently while other passengers disembarked, her movements unhurried. When the cabin had mostly emptied, she stood, her every step purposeful. In the jet bridge, Karen stood among the crew, her posture stiff and her gaze darting nervously. Beside her was James Everett, his commanding presence unmistakable. As Sophia approached, James's eyes met hers, his expression both apologetic and firm. "Sophia," he said, extending a hand. "I can't express how sorry I am for what you experienced. This behavior is unacceptable." Sophia nodded, her voice steady. "It's not just about me, James. This is about ensuring no one else is made to feel this way." James turned to Karen, his tone cold. "Karen, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Karen stammered, her words a tangled mess of half-apologies and excuses. But Sophia cut her off with a calm precision. "This isn't about intent," she said, her gaze sharp. "It's about impact. And the impact of your actions today was clear." James's verdict was swift and unyielding. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. Your behavior violates everything this company stands for." Karen's face drained of color, her protests drowned out as security personnel escorted her away. The scene was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered heavily in the air. As Sophia walked through the terminal, the whispers of change had already begun to ripple. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a step toward a broader shift in how the airline operated. Sophia knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, and she was ready to lead the charge. As Sophia Carter walked through the airline terminal, her steps were steady, her heart filled with quiet resolve. What began as a moment of indignation had become a turning point, not just for her, but for the airline and everyone who had ever been silenced in the face of injustice. For Sophia, this wasn't about revenge or proving a point, it was about showing that dignity and respect should never be negotiable. In the days that followed, Sophia reflected on what had transpired. Karen's actions, while small in scale, represented a deeper issue, a systemic problem Sophia had spent her career challenging. Yet, as she looked at the faces of employees who now felt seen and valued, she realized something profound. Change doesn't come from a single bold action but from 1,000 small ones, layered over time with persistence and courage. Sophia's determination had sparked something far greater than she imagined. It wasn't just about headphones or spilled water, it was about accountability and the power of one voice to inspire many. And while the road ahead was long, she knew the first step had been taken. As the camera fades, a flight attendant approaches Sophia on her next journey, offering her a pair of headphones with a warm smile. This time, Sophia smiles back, not because the moment feels resolved, but because it reminds her why she fought in the first place, for a future where no one has to fight for basic respect. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Real Life Stories New. Let's reach 10,000 subscribers together and continue sharing stories that inspire change and celebrate resilience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of empowerment.